Hello and welcome to my view from the piano bench, right here, and here, and everywhere else in the esoteric space. We do this every Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. here on my Joel Holt's Notes YouTube channel, in addition to Piano for My Friends every Thursday evening. Thank you for watching. Thank you to those of you who watch regularly, and thank you especially to those of you who provide support and encouragement via the link to my support page, which gives you links and options, including a low maintenance, easy take on the Patreon, turning it basically into a tip jar if you watch regularly. So again, thank you to those of you who do watch. So every week we have a topic, and in recent weeks, I've really gone super experiential and talking about specific, things related to me. And that's a bit of a turn from how it used to be. I mean, I would be varied with it, but I would do more talking about the process. I'm going to kind of back up toward that a little bit, but not a lot. Maybe be in the middle a bit. And hopefully you'll find this informative and will give you stuff to think about. And you don't have to be a musician to ponder these things, because this really has to do with our culture, ultimately. So the title of this, or the topic, is titled, my speaking is off to a good start, oh boy, The Great Divide. Now, the divide I'm talking about is ultimately a cultural divide. It's not always seen as that. And because of that, there are attempts made to bridge the divide that ultimately aren't going to work. And I realize that I just left an important piece out of my notes. And I'm going to write this down here and wing that part of it. And saying trying to bridge the divide made me think of that. And you'll understand when I get there. And we can start with this kind of well-worn phrase. They don't write songs like that anymore. I could play any number of songs and we could say that. And we all acknowledge that it's true. But there's a specific reason. I mean, there's lots of reasons, but there's a specific underlying condition that makes that true. And that condition is something to be understood because it affects everything. And that condition is what I'm calling the Great Divide. So let me begin with a song that they don't write like that anymore. Good old Great American Songbook, Hoagie, Carmichael, Stardust tune. Hoagie Carmichael's Stardust, a beautiful tune. Doesn't sound like popular music today, does it? But it was certainly the epitome of popular music in like the 1930s. Quite some time ago, and a lot has changed since then. I realized when I started the tune, for whatever reason, I said to myself, I'm not going to play the verse, I'm just going to play the tune. And often I will play the verse, which when I don't open with it, I kind of tease it at the end a little bit. But I kind of play it because I know it, and there aren't too many verses I know. You know, that and White Christmas and Easter Parade. No, not even Easter Parade. Alexander's Ragtime Band. Yeah, but anyhow, verses to tunes don't exist in popular music currently either, but that's not the meat and potatoes of what I'm talking about. So that song is representing now, and I already used the term, the Great American Songbook. And it's a very widely used phrase, and the definitions of that are a little bit fuzzy, but basically it's that era of the big bands, the era of Tin Pan Alley, the era before the cultural shift of rock and roll, which is really what this is going to be about. And, excuse me, and that era was the era in which jazz was birthed and developed, at least to a particular point. And then the very unique thing about that era is that the jazz that was happening was, by and large, popular music up into the 1940s, when everything got complicated and convoluted. Of course, I wasn't around in the 1940s, but you know, doing what I do, you kind of become the student, obviously. Whatever it is you do, you become a student of it, and you understand kind of what went on and what led to who, and you know who's on first, and all of that. So that era of those composers, Hoagie Carmichael, Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, etc., and all that wonderful Broadway stuff, that music that we ultimately call jazz, or that is performed as jazz at the very least, is ultimately an amalgam of cultures. And that's the whole great American uniqueness and the uniqueness of jazz. It's a melding pot of music. And the great illustration to kind of like set a foundation for it would be ragtime music, which would not be considered jazz, but was kind of the place stylistically and otherwise that it grew from, where you had those wonderful syncopated rhythms, but you had European classical harmonic conventions, right? And that's specifically what I'm talking about. So the popular music was rhythmic, jazz was very rhythmic, but the vocabulary, the language it was speaking was, you can't say 1,000% identical, but you can in another way. It depends on how you look at it. But the basis for the vocabulary was classical music. And you wouldn't think that, but it's true. And it's true to an amazing degree, even as music evolved. In classical music, from like the Renaissance to the Baroque era to the classical, what we call the classical era, Mozart and Haydn, and then into the Romantic era. And it's very interesting that jazz had that exact same evolution. And I'm going to save the nuts and bolts of that for another time. And I don't often hear, well, I actually really haven't heard anyone talking directly about this, but it is amazing how the evolution of classical music stylistically happened again in exactly the same way, just sped up about 5 times when jazz came along, which kind of tells you something, and tells you something that's baked in the cake, right? And with this music that had familiar harmonic conventions or familiar vocabulary, the sounds were known, they were substantive, they were artistic, you could do things with them, but then it had that wonderful rhythm, that feel. And so in the popular music, you had swinging sounds, you had substantive music, and it was accessible. It was all those things. And you'd have something like this that's just wonderful. It just is. play. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. A lovely Gershwin tune. So again, the point, and you wouldn't think this, right? Or at least it wouldn't be in the front of your head, but like the vocabulary, and I'm going to use that word instead of like harmonic conventions and scales and whatever. Vocabulary that say Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven would have used, and maybe a little beyond Beethoven as well, although Beethoven kind of went beyond himself, didn't he? It is the same sensibilities, the same vocabulary, the same language, really, that underlies this. And the evolution of classical music, as I had mentioned, from, say, Bach to Mozart to Beethoven into Debussy and into things that came thereafter, was absolutely parallel in jazz. But when we got into the 1940s, it began to get complicated, extremely complicated. And the spokes that go off this hub go in all sorts of directions. And I want to be clear, the direction that I'm talking about and focusing on is the music of the popular culture. And there's all kinds of things that happen. Jazz started to develop on purpose its own identity to separate itself from not just the popular culture, but to separate some musicians from other musicians. There's a lot of tribalism that has gone on in jazz. It's a lot better now, but it still exists. And the bebop kind of revolution was kind of a propulsion of musicians into a kind of a stratospheric place, leaving other musicians behind, right? But what it began to do, not right away, but what it began to do is leave the public behind too, especially when it continued to evolve. But while that was going on, there were other things like the musicians' union strike against the record companies, which was a period of time, and I forget, I don't really know that in great detail, but I know it was a period of time when musicians were boycotting the recording studios, so you couldn't go in there and record, but singing groups could. And singing groups could bring a guitar player. And guess who was having all the popular hits for a while? It wasn't the instrumental groups, it wasn't the big bands, it was the singers with the low bass singing a bass instead of a bass player and a guitar strumming. And then, in the midst of all kind of underlying things happening, to oversimplify things tremendously, rock and roll sprang up. And I don't want to talk about that. I'm not a historian, right? But looking over the landscape, it's very clear what happened to popular music. The culture shifted. So unlike the styles that evolved before that, now we just had this kind of cataclysmic kaboom, and then up pops Elvis Presley, and up pops bands after that, and then like the Rolling Stones, and even the Beatles, who I'm going to make the case that the Beatles are indeed substantive, but at the time, oh my goodness, was it criticized by the older big band guys because they were losing their gigs, they were losing the young people, they were losing the popular culture, and by the conventions that they were judging music, which was the European Classical Convention, she loves you, yeah, 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 in 3 chords, was not going to cut it against like the beauty of Skylark or the beauty of, any classical piece, because that rock and roll culture and then popular culture, by and large, as an underpinning, anti-establishment, anti-authority, anti-convention. So there was like no pretense that we were continuing the evolution. We were continuing being tied to those traditions. And so it kind of drifted away. And I'm also going to use this word. It's a word I used to use before because I wanted to think it through to see if I really wanted to say it, but I guess I'm going to say it. It kind of became its own theme park. The whole sort of rock and roll, popular culture theme park that was kind of a bit of a gated community with some exceptions. And gated meaning that, things weren't going to get in, like the conventions that informed popular music before. So I'm avoiding getting technical, but I hope I'm making the point that there's a real reason why they don't write them like that anymore, because that was shoved over here for this, and a few chords you could figure out in the guitar. Now, this is not to trash rock and roll. This is to make a point that the foundation of it was different. The motivations were different. The appeal of it was different. And for better or worse, and I'm going to allow other people to comment on that as best as I can make that happen. Or hold my tongue. But, related to what I'm going to say, the older I get, the more important it is to avoid being tribal. To avoid insisting that everyone has to see through the same lenses that you do. Which doesn't mean that, good and bad and right and wrong are completely relative. But it does mean that people have different perceptions for all kinds of different reasons. And rather than, shoot, bullets and bombs across the field, you should walk over and you should shake hands and hold hands, right? So the appeal of the popular music was different. The connection to history in the popular culture has been increasingly lost. So now we're in a whole different place. So the intersection, or the introduction, of rock and roll creates that dividing line. The center of gravity of the sensibility of the music and the culture became substantively different. Now, let's talk about jazz for a minute, which is what you would probably expect me to talk about. And what jazz has done is maintained its connection to history while inserting itself as best it can in things that would make it culturally relevant, even as it continued to evolve into a language that was not really culturally relevant. I'm just reading today, I'm going to leave the artist out, but a substantive, revered, wonderful, jazz artist who's still alive and was instrumental in fusion music and all of that. People who are more traditionally minded in jazz could go to his concerts, and one was commenting about that, and call it noise and walk out. And that's a whole different discussion, all right? So jazz was trying to create some connection with rock and roll, jazz fusion, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, etc. And jazz, smooth jazz is kind of a pop R&B kind of connection, and then rock and roll. Some rockers incorporated classical conventions. So, the whole idea of touching history was not completely, totally lost, but it was more like, sparks and flickers rather than the continual, just hard thread. Was it 10 years ago or something or so that Long, the classical pianist, performed with Metallica at the Grammy Awards? Yeah, so it's like, but it's still not the same thing. And this is where I was going to talk about something, and it was important, and I'm going to talk about it, but I didn't put it in my notes. So this is not really like inserted cleanly, but a really good place to look at this, and a place where I'm kind of grounded in and have interacted in this world, is the cultural struggles that churches went through, and they're in terms of music. And mostly they're on the other side of it now, but not entirely, or they're working through it. And of course, traditional church music is based in classical music, right? And then, like in the 60s, like folk tunes began creeping in, and the Catholic Church would have folk masses, and folk tunes would come into the Protestant church. It's not a folk tune, I don't know what it is, but kind of the 60s. Or like the Pass It On or C key first. Of course, when I play, there's going to be, more jazz sounding harmony. In fact, that particular tune, I forget the name of the composer. It was from the 60s, Seek Ye First the Kingdom of God. And I posted a YouTube video, you can find it, of me doing it in a church. And apparently the composer of the tune, this is what I'm drawing from what happened, searches YouTube and finds out, looks at people who post her tune. So she seemed to be, pleased that I took her tune in that direction, right? And then what began to happen in churches was the church would begin to want to cater to younger people, right? So you would have a service that would have the folk music, and then eventually like the contemporary Christian rock and all of that. And then churches would often have contemporary services and traditional services in order to appeal to different cultures, right? Which, and you know that I have a history of being involved as a church musician. And that's problematic on a theological level, right? And some people understood that and would try to do what they would call blended worship, right? And then you would have like the same musicians playing like contemporary tunes and hymns, and but what inevitably happens is the cultural sensibilities of one or the other are going to override the music. In order to do that, you almost have to have multiple sets of musicians, or have somebody, trained and skilled to be able to actually do all that, to be a classical musician, to be able to authentically play rock music and the stuff in between, which is what I attempted to bring into the church the last time I did that. The idea, and this is going to be a detour because it's not what the subject is about specifically, but the idea that the role of the musician in a church, to me, is the same as the role of a preacher, which is to present the revelation, present the message, in this case, the beauty of God's creation, in the most substantive way possible, which means that even in the popular music where it's not about substance. You bring the substance in because substance and creation speaks in, I'm trying to come up with a word and I can't put the syllables, revelatorily, you know, but this is going down a theological road that I don't intend to. But it's been a giant problem in churches. And now what's kind of happening is the same thing that's happening everywhere else. As the older Great American Songbook, equate that with people who love old hymns, kind of, you know, the same era, right? How do you put it? They're dying off, right? And that doesn't pull much weight anymore. And it's only in like more high churches and, you know, traditional mainline churches and more you know, liberal churches that promote the arts where that music remains. But in the mega churches and the conservative churches and the evangelical churches, you know, white churches, not black churches, and or African American churches, another thing, you know, it's just all contemporary now. And yeah, I have a lot of feelings about that, but it's a response to the culture. Now, what do we do about that? Or how do we handle that? Or how do we react to it? And that's the big thing that every arts grounded musician has to come up with. And the first thing that you are confronted with and accept is that the great likelihood is that you're going to have a diminished audience. You know, you're not going, or you're going to find a way to, well, I'm not even going to say that. I'm not going through my notes. I'm going out of my head. And let me just talk about me. I'm going to attempt as much as I can to be a bridge. And that's what I do anyway. So let me let that sit there for a second. And let me say this. You're going to hear a term come out of me. And you're going to see that term in promotions for mainstay shows. New Great American Songbook. And that's kind of a loosely understood canon of music that came in mostly the 60s and 70s that carries in its own way the sensibilities forward and are indeed substantive tunes, even if not organized quite the same way. And I mentioned the Beatles. Now, Beatles started out doing, you know, 3-chord rock and roll stuff. But those guys were really substantive musicians, and the whole thing evolved quickly. And there are wonderful Beatles tunes that kind of are grounded in the convention. So that's kind of a, I don't want to say a light in the darkness, but a place to come in, right? So when I talk about like rock and roll, you know, it's all very complicated, of course, and everything has an evolution. But there are, when I say they don't write them like that anymore, you know, there's exceptions to every rule, even though it's its own thing. But like, here's a Beatles tune. really nice tune. And lots of jazz musicians have covered Beatles tunes, especially, the tunes like that. Yeah, what a beautiful tune. So I talked about bridge building, and I'm going to hopefully come back to that, circle that, because I want to bring up experiences as a music therapist. When I came into music therapy, which you've likely heard me talk about, and it was a product of just how I was perceiving making music, right? And then I began to have opportunities and receive some additional perspective on the whole on the whole thing. And because this was like the 1990s, and here's one little tidbit. If you're talking about Alzheimer's disease in particular, I know which is like not a pleasant subject, but in geriatrics and music therapy, that's a big thing. And you're probably familiar with the idea that music will get through when other things don't. And that's because, by and large, the part of the brain that processes music is not affected by Alzheimer's disease until like the very end. And I've read somewhere, I've not seen the study, and I'm not sure how they did it, but they've demonstrated that while other parts of the brain are deteriorating, you can still grow musically. And that's a big part of what music will do, is redirect activity in the brain. Not just in geriatrics, but in other things for therapeutic and specific purposes. And long-term memory, which is the memory that remains, is really like college years. You think it's like you just remember when you were a little kid. You actually remember like when you were a teenager in your early 20s. And those are the memories, that's the place where you live. So that music is the bullseye music, right? So let's say it's 1995. And let's say I'm in a retirement home. And there's someone who is 85 years old, and it's a memory impairment, which means that they're going to live in their long-term memories. So you do the math. This is what's going through my mind all the time. You do the math. 1910, 85, right? 95, 1910, and then you like tick up to like 20 years or so. So then what was going on in 1930, right? Because in I have this math wrong. Something isn't right. And I shouldn't be doing this. I can't edit these videos, so I just have to post it the way it is. All right? So 95 minus 85 is 10, plus 20 is 30. Okay, 1930. Yeah, 1930. Duh. So, what can I play? Oh, I think this song was written in 1930. Right? It's also known in the 80s, thanks to When Harry Met Sally, where I could play this tune. Or I could play older tunes that would be remembered from that time, too. I remember back then, it was like, I would still occasionally get requests, for tunes like Darktown Strutter's Ball, or tunes that even went back into the 1800s, but that era, 30s and 40s, really, was long-term memory. And it was also for people who weren't suffering from, those horrible things, people who were well and independent, that was still like, meat and potatoes music for them too. And big bands were still a thing. You could find radio stations that still had swing music like in the 80s and 90s, and then it all went away. as the music of that culture shifted. And I was seeing that coming. Back in like the mid 90s, I was looking ahead to roughly now. And I was speaking tongue in cheek. I made a joke out of it, but it was completely serious. And I'm saying, I say this to activity directors or other musicians or other staff people. These residents here now grew up in like homes where the kids would like sing around the piano and the mom would play, right? And pianos were in every home, not in their homes per se, like when they had families, but when they were growing up and they were kids. And the piano was centered, and the piano was like always centered. Like I play piano, right? All my programs are piano and people are around the piano. I'd say, well, yeah, 15, 20 years from now, ain't going to be that. You're going to have a bunch of people sitting around the guitar singing, "We all live in a yellow submarine." And the impact of that was just like, good grief, compared to what was just so meat and potatoes in like healthcare and nursing home communities at that time. But the culture has absolutely shifted. So when I talk about bridge building, I mean a lot of things by that. And I kind of landed on that term strongly when Mainstay Mondays became a thing. And I realized that what I was doing was, because I'm part of a local community. By the way, there is a radio interview that I did last week on a local station. And the podcast link I put in my Facebook page, and I'm going to hopefully like try to grab the audio and upload it to make it accessible. I was kind of verbally coherent that day, and I got a lot of things said that I'm fairly pleased with, and talked really a lot about this. I live in this local community, this local area, Kent County, Maryland, and I don't like to say this. I'm starting to say it in public lately, and I've been really reluctant to. The idea of big fish in a small pond kind of thing, and not what I set out to do, but it's kind of the case here in that, I have wonderful opportunities, and I'm just totally supported and get all kind of love here, and it's allowed me to be able to do stuff. But I don't see myself as somebody who is simply here to conquer the small pond and be king of the anthill or whatever. I'm looking to make contributions wherever I go, whether it's in my town, or whether it's in a city 2 states over, or whether it's across the country, or whatever. There are different components to what I do. And because of that, I can kind of be a bridge between those things. And a lot of the Mainstay Monday things was like reaching into our local culture and then reaching out and bringing like regional professional players or even some national players in and connecting dots, right? And being a bridge. And being a bridge just means connecting parts. One of the Mainstay Mondays, one of the initial ones where I pushed myself out, where I decided, okay, I'm going to try to just do something. I don't know how it's going to work, but I believe it can, which was the first time I collaborated with a classical singer, an operatic soprano from our local classical music festival, who would come in, wasn't local, but would come in every summer. And it's like, let's not be tribal. Let's take this jazz and let's take this classical, and how do they intersect and hold hands and do it. And then there's a recent Mainstay Monday show, not Mainstay Monday, First Friday show about that. You can see on the Mainstay Livestream's YouTube channel that we approached that a little differently. But the idea of the bridge and taking now popular songs that I can get myself around, and then bringing my sensibility to them is kind of like being a bridge, and trying to find ways to be accessible to people, and certainly not be in the conundrum that some musicians that I would have been in the company of before are in, where like all the gigs went away and now what happened, and now they just pretty much don't play. Because you have to you have to kind of ground yourself in, you have to connect with people around you, but you don't compromise yourself in doing it. So like if I'm, finding ways to connect to people, say my age, and not, like people who aren't alive anymore because they would be 110 now, right? I can still do the things that I did before. I can bring them in and I can like, hey, check this out, while I'm also building the bridge to them with music. So here's something interesting. Billy Joel, I heard an interview of him, and he confessed, he kind of did it as a confession really, that he, for a period of time, I think in the 1960s, studied with Lenny Tristano. Lenny Tristano was a kind of cutting edge at the time jazz pianist, and Billy Joel said that he wishes he had taken it more seriously at the time, because he realized now what he was learning and how important that was. But that said, those sensibilities of that Great American Songbook era totally come into Billy Joel's tunes, and that's another place that you can go, and a place where I can be a bridge, and I play a tune like this. And I'm going to just keep trying to figure out, and it's a long process for me, how to relate to those tunes so that I can continue to connect with people but bring my sensibilities into them. And I struggle with that because, and as you'll hear in this radio interview in a lot more detail if you listen to it, I'm going to be playing cultural catch-up the rest of my life because I left my culture behind when I discovered all that old swinging music that I fell in love with. And now my mind just blanked. Isn't that perfect? Not really. So yeah, the conundrum is the cultural shift. And now I'm going to really get in trouble when I say this. It's hard for me to watch Super Bowl halftime shows. Let's go that way, because there's really no intersection at all. But I know that young musicians who are jazz musicians and greatly artistic are like working in the whole hip hop realm with the jazz and all of that, But I'm going to stand my ground with the idea that things got really disrupted in the whole evolutionary development when the culture really embraced anti-establishment, anti-authority, right? And then it's been this just sort of like, semi-ungrounded thing that everyone is sort of making the best of in terms of like, what do we do with the arts with it? When it was really clean up until everything got complicated starting in the late 1940s. We'll see what kind of response I get to this, if any. So I think what I'm going to do is just going to go back to a wonderful They Don't Write Them Like That Anymore tune and try to just like clean up the messes I made. Ha! right. Thank you for being here. I welcome any feedback, comments in the video, or as some of you do, emails to me. That's all cool. Thanks for your engagement, and I'll see you perhaps tomorrow night, and hopefully in person sometime soon.